Welcome back, listeners. This is RJ Carter for Critical Blast, continuing what I had started yesterday, which was a retailer report found in the 48th edition of the Overstreet Comic Book Price Guide. This retailer report came from Michael Tierney at Collector's Edition and the Comic Book Store, two stores that he owns in Central Arkansas, and his report is to the Price Guide. For those who don't know how the Overstreet Guide works, if you've never had one, then you're not really into comics. I've been collecting for most of my 50 years. Started reading in kindergarten, so yeah, I've been around a while. And when I first got my hands on one of the price guides, about 30 years ago, more than that, wow. It was interesting because you'd always look up the standbys and the stalwarts and say, oh look, Action Comics #1, that's going for $1,500. I'll never have that much money. Now, of course, if you look at it today, well, let me just take this 48th edition one I've got here and just take a peek. Dum, 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 dum. Adventure, Action Comics #1. Yeah, it's going for, it's increased a little bit from that. It's like about 3,800,000 now in near mint. So not a bad investment if you bought one of them at that super inflated price 30 years ago. But the way they come up with these prices is they track sales and they get opinions from retailers who write their reports up and say, hey, I've had a lot of customer interest in this issue, so it's selling well, you can raise the price. Or, hey, I've had one of these books sitting on my shelf now for 8 months and nobody cares, it may be overinflated in its value. Well, that's exactly what this is. It's a recount of what's happened in the past year at this particular store based on customer interactions and sales numbers, and this retailer's experience, which goes back another 30 years. And we're going to continue here. Yesterday we talked about the Marvel sales drop-off as being reported in this dialogue with the readers, and how the retailer squarely placed the blame on Marvel's drop-off on the Social Justice Warrior Initiative. So let's see how the rest of the report fans out here. One of these trends is the certainty that I will never again see a book sell in quantities like Superman #75. This is because the current sales model that publishers follow. With a single distributor, publishers have begun guarding actual information until the release and instead feed retailers a steady diet of hyperbole. When Wolverine lost his adamantium, it was hinted that he might get it back in multiple solicitations. Fortunately, I didn't bite, because none of those books contained anything special. Wolverine Volume 2, number 45, is where he finally returned to normal, and was a complete surprise. I ended up missing out on a whole lot of sales, and never had a chance to cultivate new readers with that event. Despite the intentionally stunted print run, the issue rarely sells as a back issue. Another example of similar results from DC was their Death of the Family Batman event. The original Death in the Family featured the death of Jason Todd Robin, and was a monster seller for DC. The entire 4-issue series in Batman 426 through 429 has maintained value and demand across the intervening decades. In the more recent Death in the Family, the Damian version of Robin died immediately after the event was over, in issue number 8 of the soon-to-be-canceled Batman Inc. spin-off. That was another example of a book that would have sold monster numbers if retailers had a clue. Second printings did ship soon after, but received a lackluster response. Perhaps DC banked on customers instead turning to digital copies, but this is a collectibles hobby, and no customer I've ever talked with took that route. And there has never been any back issue demand for that book either. Yet another example of how frustrating fans can have negative long-term results. Marvel sales free fall intensified in November, with DC widening the gap to a 40% lead. There have been short spells where DC outsold Marvel in the past, the most recent being last year's DC Rebirth relaunch, but none have been by such wide margins. This was a sea change, where Marvel's ebbing sales lacked only a declaration by James Earl Jones in his most menacing Darth Vader voice about how complete their failure was. Apparently, Marvel's publisher heard the echo of Darth Vader's words when it was announced in November that Axel Alonso was out as the editor-in-chief and C.B. Cebulski was in. Independent comic sales were overall steady, with no major new breakout titles, but a lot of reliable titles pounding out the most effective sales formula of them all: good stories with good art. Unfortunately, some independent publishers made the same mistakes that Marvel is making and DC once made. Magnus Robot Fighter was reinvented as a woman, and another classic Gold Key character, Turok, was also revamped, once again. In the miniseries Sovereigns, Magnus looked like he was still a guy, but had robotic attachments. None of these sold at either store. When Jim Shooter and Valiant relaunched the Gold Key characters back in the 90s, he stayed faithful to the established formulas and coupled them with solid stories. They sold by the hundreds. When Shooter left, the heroes were morphed into the dysfunctional anti-hero mold that is so popular with writers today, but not with my customers. Sales dropped steadily until there were none. The mishmashes didn't stop there. Robert E. Howard's Cull the Barbarian was reinvented as a time-traveling warrior in yet another example of a complete sales fail. Cull the Eternal sold to a single person between both of my stores. The sad thing about all this is that it used to be Hollywood that always tried to reinvent the comics characters and ended up with epic failures. Nowadays, comics are doing well in the movies, which stay faithful to the original comics, and the current comics are the ones doing the reinventing. The resulting failures remain the same. Whenever you reinvent the wheel, you get a square, and that's hard to roll with. An axle will end up hitting the road, Marvel pun intended. When customers can't find what they want on the new comics rack, they turn to vintage inventory. Key DC sales showed a lot of influence from the Justice League movie. Aquaman #1 sold in good for $130 and #2 in good for $42. Atom #1 for $225 in very good plus. And here he goes into a list of basically a lot of back issues and what they sold for. This is pretty much what the Overstreet Guide is for. As I mentioned, you give your summary of the year, and then you start showing some specific issues and what they sold for on your back issue market, indicating what the demand of the customers is and what your specific inventory is. So if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about that, I encourage you to pick up this issue of Overstreet, this volume of Overstreet, since it's an annual. Tierney concludes the article with many buyers reallocating their weekly new comics budget into vintage comics, back issues priced below $20 had very strong demand. So while the number of key high-dollar sales were down, the overall volume of lower-priced back issues were up, which is pretty good advice. And I've seen that already bandied about on the internet from people who are frustrated with the current crop of new comics out there. Go to the back issues. You can always find issues of your favorite character as they were back in the day. And as the saying goes, if you haven't read it, it's new to you. For Critical Blast, I'm RJ Carter.